Colchester, and welcome to Question Time. And on our panel tonight, the Conservative Secretary of State for Business and a member of Theresa May's inner cabinet, Greg Clark, Labour's Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott, who this year celebrates 30 years as an MP, the former head of the Met, who resigned this year at the end of 6 years as Commissioner, Lord Hogan-Howe, the crime writer and Brexit supporter, Dreda Say Mitchell, and the former boss of Marks and Spencer, who chaired the campaign for Britain to stay in the EU, Stuart Rose. And as ever, what's talked about here is always contentious, and if you want to join in from home, just a reminder, our hashtag is BBCQT on Twitter or on Facebook, or you can text 83981, push the red button and you'll see what other people are saying. Our first question tonight is from Joe Richardson, please. Joe.
Workers are worse off now than 10 years ago, and the future looks equally gloomy. To quote, astonishing. What is the point of capitalism?
What is the point of capitalism? Stuart Rose.
Well, that's a tough question to get asked firstly this evening. Thank you, Joe, very much for that one. Listen, we are facing very tough times, and I've no doubt we'll talk about the budget at some point, but one of the things we really need to talk about in the context of where we are today is not the budget, but the economy. And I'm afraid all the signs, as you know, are not good. It doesn't matter who you refer to, whether it's the IFS, whether it's the ONS, whether it's the Bank of England. All the indicators are that we have gone from being one of the top performers of the G7, one of the top performers in the world, one of the top performers in Europe in terms of growth, and we're now nearly at the bottom of the league. And that's happened in the last 6 or 12 months. And I don't want to open the debate straight away about saying that's all caused by Brexit. Forget about Brexit. It's irrelevant to the extent that we still have the problem. Our country is facing a very difficult time, and I think what we need to do is face up to it. What we need to do is understand the reasons for it. We have to articulate to everybody, yourselves and to the country at wide, why those reasons are there, what we think we can do about it, and we've got to join together to find solutions. It's not easy, it will take time, but I'm afraid the future is a little bit gloomy, and I do say it's gloomier because of the situation we're finding ourselves in terms of politics today and Brexit.
Diane Abbott.
Capitalism is a way of organising the economy, but the problems with capitalism arise, first of all, when it's unregulated or not properly regulated. It was bankers who were not properly regulated that tipped us into the economic crisis, which we're still struggling with. I'm not against bankers, no, not really, but they should have been properly regulated. It's also an issue when you try and inject the market and capitalism into areas where it has no business. For instance, the health service. I believe that the health service should be free at the point of use. So I can see that politics is a way of organising the world, but we can see both here and in the United States and across the world what unregulated capitalism and injecting the market into the wrong situations can lead to.
Greg Clark, this idea that workers are worse off than 10 years ago, and we know the gloomy predictions in this budget, one of the gloomiest budgets any of us have ever heard. Does it mean capitalism isn't working, isn't delivering?
Well, first of all, if you look at capitalism, and for all the flaws, it's a bit like what Winston Churchill said about democracy. Look at the alternative, and if you really want to see the effects on people, look at socialist societies, look at Venezuela, look at Cuba. Look at Eastern Europe. the role of capitalism, the role of business, let's put it that way, is absolutely essential. It is by working, by paying taxes, by producing things that we all consume, that we are employed. Taxes are paid to support our public services. It's absolutely vital. Lots of us outside the family and education, lots of us fulfill our potential through our world of work in companies. So let's not be against business and successful business, because I would say that every successful society has successful businesses. Of course, they need to be prosperous, and they need to respect the people's rights, but you can't have a successful society unless you have thriving businesses.
Right, man up there.
Yeah. Regarding Diane Abbott saying about the bankers, wasn't it Gordon Brown at the Mansion House speech where he said he wanted to encourage the risk takers?
I have to tell you, I was in Parliament at that time, and I didn't hear a single solitary Conservative MP saying they wanted tougher regulation on bankers.
But you admit Gordon Brown did say that.
And just to refer to what Greg said, I took care to say that I wasn't against business. I was pointing out what happens when there isn't proper regulation, what happens when you have a society driven by greed. Because when a society is driven by greed, then it's actually the most vulnerable who always suffer.
OK, I'll come back to you. You, sir, over there.
I would say there's nothing wrong with capitalization and capitalism. The problem, all the socialist countries have failed, and capitalism has succeeded across the world. The problem is globalization and the fact that the rules are not the same for everyone. The multinationals are capable of doing business in every countries, or most countries, apart from those that still have some kind of sovereignty, without paying tax. How can local and national companies compete with those multinationals? It is a downward spiral which is going to bring, like we're seeing across the EU nations, increasing unemployment, increasing cost, increasing tax to try to gain back some money and cover the increasing cost. So the EU has been failing for the last 25 years. Okay. The EU is not the solution. It is the cause of the increasing unemployment and problems that we have. It's not capitalism. If everyone had a chance to make a business and only pay 4% of tax, which is what most of the 100 multinationals are doing in the EU, I would bet that Europe would be a better place.
Okay. Lord Hogan-Howe, I will come to you.
I suppose it's in my nature, but I would probably challenge a little the underpinning assumption in the question, which is that we're in a horrible place and it's terrible and things will never get better. What we've got is 2 quarters of economic data, and that's important, and it might tell us there's a trend, but we don't know for certain yet. And, of course, the judgments are delivered by economists. Now, there may be economists in the audience. I don't know. The gentleman who just spoke may well be an economist. But what we know with economists is they're not always very good at predicting the future. They can explain and analyse the past, but they can't always predict the future. So I'm not entirely sure that we're in such a terrible place. But clearly, there is a challenge for a while. I would have said that
the Chancellor of the Exchequer seems to think we're in a pretty terrible place.
Well, what he's saying is that the growth is not as high as they was expecting.
1.4% or something for the next...
I think it's the first time for a while it's been below 2%. So it's clearly not as good as everybody wants. But it's not zero, and it's not less than zero. So my point is, before we overreact, we ought to at least understand what we are facing. I think generally that...
But people are already living in such desperate situation. You're talking as if, Bernard, things are not bad for people. Currently, we've got 6 million people jammed, just about managing. We've got 2 out of 5 households, actually, who can't afford to do the things that they want to do. We've got 42% of people who cannot go away annually 1 week on a holiday. And the thing I meant with 2 households out of 5, they cannot save a tenner a month. If that is not bad, and what the government now is saying to people is probably things are going to get worse. And also on top of that, where is the investment in our young people? We're talking about...
But don't make too many points. Let Bernard...
My point My point is not, because you just described my childhood, more or less. So my point is not to dismiss that type of background. But my point is that we can still have a positive attitude about the economy. That's my first point. The second point is in terms of capitalism, I think generally it's the better of the alternatives. And I think and I agree entirely with what Diane said, it ought to be a regulated capitalism. There needs to be, make sure that we have a regulation.
But also, just a second.
Okay. Which is the second point, which is it ought to be caring as well. And I think that it isn't always caring. No. I think the incentive for capitalism is about making profit, and that is a good thing. It generates wealth, and that helps us. But I don't think it always cares about those people you just described. So that's where the state has to take a part.
I'll come to you, Stuart. Let's hear some more members of the woman there in the third row. Yes, of course you can. Yes.
Hi, yeah, I agree with Diane Abbott completely, and I do think capitalism is failing us. I do think it has to be regulated. I completely agree with what you said. To the Tory MP, I don't see why you have to make this comparison with socialist is a bad option. In what other alternative is there? Well, I'm sorry, but socialism for me is a great alternative.
Okay,
I would like to see the Labour Party get in next time there's an election.
Okay, Greg Clark. Hang on. Let Mr. Clark reply.
What I would say to the lady is that we've had a test of this in practice. I understand that the socialists were well motivated. They wanted to make their countries better, but time and time again it has failed, and people have been pushed into poverty. But can I just pick up on something that Diane
let him just finish, because he hasn't been speaking.
Diane made a point. She said that in response to a member of the audience, that no Conservative MP called out Gordon Brown when this deregulation of the city was happening. That is not true. I'll tell you one Conservative MP, Peter Lilly, who was the Conservative Shadow Chancellor, and at that moment, when the Bank of England, that had always been a very dependable, responsible regulator of financial services, was being moved away, what Peter Lilly said in the House of Commons was that this was the government taking its eye off the ball, and spivs and crooks would have a field day. And that is exactly what happened, and that is what he predicted and opposed.
That's some time back. Maybe we should... Maybe we should come back to the present and to yesterday's budget and to the prediction of flat growth and no change in people's take-home pay for a decade or more. Stuart Rose, you were trying to get...
Well, I just want to go back... What's your name? Jackie, I just want to go back to the point that you made, if I might say so, because I think I'd just like to be clear in my own mind in this audience about whether we would all agree that the creation of wealth for all of us is a good thing. Because if we don't have wealth and money to spend, we cannot build hospitals, we cannot build roads, we cannot build universities, we cannot educate our children, we cannot even spend the money that some parties might choose us to want to spend. So is the creation of wealth a good thing? I think most of us would say yes.
Yeah, creation of wealth, but what I was trying to say was that the Tory MP was saying that businesses... we all need businesses. Yes, we need creation of wealth. Yes, we need businesses. Socialism doesn't say we don't, does it?
No, but my next point would be, so I agree with you. The creation of wealth is a good thing. And I've spent all my life in business, and I have been engaged in the creation of wealth with people. In my most recent full-time job with 100,000 people who depended upon us to make sure that we create the right amount of money, to pay them the wages, to pay for the investment in our business, to pay our taxes, and to pay for the hospitals, the schools, and whatever else.
Sorry, but it's got to trickle down as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the key question... getting paid nothing, while the top ones are getting extraordinary, ridiculous amounts of money.
Jackie.
We're all suffering austerity.
Jackie, I think we're going to be in violent agreement. I agree with you in the sense that it's about the distribution of wealth that we should have the conversation about.
Let's go on. The man at the back there, with spectacles on, in the second row from the back.
So we've got the socialists arguing with the capitalists saying it's one or the other, when the reality is what is needed is a third way. And what we really need is we need to encourage entrepreneurs, we need to encourage the creation of wealth, but with that, we need to also encourage people to be compassionate, to people to look after the poor, people to look after our relatives who are in old people's homes that aren't fit for purpose anymore. We need a compassionate economic system that works for everyone.
To pick up Joe Richardson's question, do you think that the future looks gloomy?
Me?
Yes?
No, I think I'm a glass is half full kind of person, to be honest. I think there are organisations, I think there's the voluntary sector who are doing incredible work. We've talked this evening earlier about food banks and such like. There are people like that that are working really hard. It's just a shame that they're needed. I do think we need to look after the more vulnerable members of society more than we currently do.
OK. And the woman over here on the right. Yes.
I'm actually an economist by trade. So there are economists in the audience. And I think what's always important is economic growth, but inclusive economic growth. Even here within Essex, we have these coastal areas that are really deprived, and it is sharing that wealth. There's a lot of focus in London rather than, say, maybe in the north. And I know there's a bit in the budget about moving towards that. And I think it's really, really important about spreading that wealth, not just between generations, but across regions.
Okay. What's the difference in growth in different regions of Britain? Is the northwest, for instance, or the northeast doing better than the south in terms of actual growth, not in total prosperity?
Well, actually, the fastest growing part of the country now is the northwest. It used to be the case. That is, the gap has closed. But there's further to go. I think everyone knows, London and the southeast are still ahead in terms of productivity. And that is the big challenge. Those people that have said that actually it's not either or, that we do have a role in making sure that, that the prosperity that is enjoyed by people who are earning well, companies that are doing well, is spread across the whole country. And the challenge that we have is this productivity challenge that was laid out in the...
Can you try and use sort of ordinary English?
Rather than economy.
I mean, the productivity challenge is hardly going to get everybody fired up, is it?
So what it is this, that it takes people in Germany 4 days to produce what people in the UK take 5 days to produce. And that means that they can pay themselves better, or they need to work
Well, whose
fewer
fault
hours.
is this?
So this is it's a long-standing challenge of the British economy, and it has a number of different causes. And what we need to do, and this is not a party political point because it's something that embraces the trade unions, leaders of councils, universities, and everyone else, is looking at what you need to do to improve that. You need to improve training and education. You need to improve our level of scientific research and applying that in practice. You need to have better infrastructure around the country.
Okay, this
and
is a speech.
Is what we need to do in order to improve productivity.
Dreda, I'll come to you.
I mean, I just listen to this and see my whole background is kind of grassroots. I'm not a politician. And what I hear from people day in, day out is big companies, the people at the top get all the money. They don't get a lot of money. They're seen as cheap labour. We live in a hire, fire type of economy. Somehow along, we've got to start taking care of our workers, because the way you were talking about productivity, it was almost as if the workers are the problem. The workers are not working quickly enough. That's what I picked up from it. So we've got to start thinking about the type of society we want to be. I don't use words like capitalism and socialism. I think about what is the type of society I want the next generation to be living in. And I want them to be able to think when they go to work, they will be in caring environments, they will be looked after, they will get a decent wage. We talked about, you know, the society that we're in. If you think about the public sector, because I think about my days as a teacher, is full of people who were serving the community. So why is it that they are not being paid properly? Why is it that their money is being stopped? If we're so caring, we've got to look after the people. We've got to look after the people who care for us. That is a big job that the government has to do. And it was one of the things in the budget that really, really, I felt disappointed and very upset about.
OK. Let's just go back to some members of our audience. The woman in the third row, in the centre there, yes.
Surely the prime job of a politician is to serve their community. And the problem with our society is not capitalism or socialism, it's that our politicians are not serving their communities.
In what way?
They are not listening to the community, they are not engaging with the community are having politics done to them rather than being engaged in the process.
Diane?
well, I wanted to respond very quickly.
Can you respond to her first, just before?
Well, I do listen to my community, and even when it got me into trouble with my leadership, like when I listened to my community on the Iraq War, I did what my community wanted. But just to respond
what about all the politicians, for example, who sat in a Remain constituency but voted to leave, or vice versa?
Oh, well, I mean, the referendum was a vote to leave. And I think there's a democratic issue about taking the referendum vote seriously. What type of Brexit we have is another matter, and it's my view that the Tories are mismanaging the negotiation from top to bottom. But just to quickly respond to Greg, he said that Peter Lilly voted not to make the Bank of England independent.
I'm sorry, Peter Lilly, how many years back are we... What are we talking about? We're here in 2017. When did Peter Lilly leave the House of Commons?
Diana made the point.
No, you made the point, didn't you?
I corrected
well,
let's leave Peter Lilly to one side,
we'll leave
shall we?
Peter Lilly.
Yeah.
But there's a serious point. Greg's main argument was to offer this completely false dichotomy between, you know, Trump's America on the one hand and Cuba on the other hand. There are other models of society. Look at the Scandinavian countries. They have far better public health, much more equal, much better health service. Don't talk about extremes. What we want is a fair, a more equal, and a genuinely social democratic society.
I just want to pick up the German comparison, because I think it's an interesting point, because many of the people who can afford to will buy German products. And I think one of the things that the government has a responsibility to do, which I didn't see enough of in the budget, because it was one of the things, not how much tax was reduced, I was looking for a vision or something that we could all start to think about. So if one of the things that we need to do is to embed quality in the way things we do, then you have to do something about that. You have to set up systems. You have to look at research and development so that the investment goes into the good ideas. We've had great ideas in this country, but we never seem to make it often to actually manufacturing thing. Education, clearly a vital part of making sure that things are developed. You know, the government talked about during the election involving workers on the boards. But that hasn't happened. It does happen in Germany. My point is, I'm not saying the German economy is the best, but it's a pretty strong one. And some of the things they do, I think government does have a responsibility to strategic level to set that context. I don't think we see it often enough. We see what can be regarded as gimmicks, the odd idea, attractive for a bit, but it doesn't pay you back for 5 years, and that's the sort of thing I think we need to see.
Let's, no, you've got plenty more time to talk. I think we'll move on to another aspect of the budget. Because we've got a lot of questions on the budget. I can't get through them all. But one of the key ones was the next one. Just before we come to that, though, I should tell viewers where we're going to be next week, Scarborough, and Swansea the week after that. So if you're watching in Scarborough or Swansea, want to come to Question Time, the details are on the screen of how to get there, and I'll give those at the end. But let's go to this other aspect of it, which was very central to a lot of people's concerns about the economy at the moment. From John Acker, please. John Acker.
Yes. Can the budget fix the broken housing market?
Can the budget fix the broken housing market? Diane Abbott?
No. The housing crisis we face has more than one dimension. There are homeless people, and actually that all is tied up with what's happening in private housing. There are people paying astronomical rents nowadays, 60% of your income on rental. There are people that want to own their own homes, and there are people that may have a home but are very worried about their children. So no, this budget does not deal with all of those issues.
What would you have wanted it to do?
I would have wanted
if it had been your budget or McDonald's budget.
Well, if it had been my budget, we'd have brought in some measure of rent control. And if it had been my budget, we would have been borrowing to invest in council housing. Now, the Tories seem to think there's some sort of stigma about council housing, but actually, good quality, well-managed council housing is part of the whole housing mix. If you just rely on subsidies to builders so people can buy overpriced houses, you're never going to meet the real housing need.
Can we just get the borrowing thing clarified? You'd borrow how much, and what would you do with it? Give it to the councils or allow councils to borrow? What would the plan be?
As you probably know, Bank of England base rate now is about 0.5%. If we get into government, as I hope we do maybe next year, maybe 2022, we will, exactly, the estimate is that we'd be borrowing at around 2%. If you borrow to invest, which is what we say we are going to do, whether it's investing in infrastructure or whether it's investing in housing, you get a return on that investment. If you talk to merchant banks about what private sector investors get out of investing in infrastructure, for instance, you're looking at 8–10%. So we're very clear. We would borrow to invest in things like housing and infrastructure, and even Tories understand that. His colleague, Sajid Javid, was talking about borrowing 50 billion to invest in housing until he was slapped down by Philip Hammond. So yes, we would borrow, but we would get a return on that money because we'd be investing in things that the community needs.
Yeah. And why didn't you do that?
So the truth is that for many generations of governments of all different colours, we have not been building the number of homes that we needed, and that has to be faced up to, and that is true.
Why didn't you do what she's suggesting?
So Dan suggested that Dan suggested that we should allow councils to build council houses. In the budget, that is precisely what they have been not just allowed but encouraged to do. There is £1 billion that is going to be available to councils for that. And so far from having any objection to councils building houses, I think it is a fantastic thing. In fact,
You're not freeing councils to borrow as much as they want to build houses,
No, it's part of the national debt.
Yeah, but that's the point she's making. At low interest rates, you can afford to borrow a lot more.
But they are being able to borrow
they can't borrow
£1 billion more. But there are more council houses that have been built in the last 7 years than under the entire period of Diane's period of
for tat stuff.
No,
the thing is,
it's
you admit there's a big problem about housing. You say there is. All the speeches, the conference, Tory conference, you say it. When it comes to it, what have we offered? 300,000 new houses by 2022 or something. I mean, it's not. It's nothing. It's nothing to grab the imagination or comfort people who are looking for houses. Is it?
So 300,000 homes a year was the level of house building that we achieved when Harold Macmillan, after the war, was the housing minister. That is what we need to do to make a big difference. 300,000 a year is a lot. But actually, we are making big progress compared to where we were after the financial crisis. I mean, the figures just came out in the last few weeks. In the last year, we added 217,000. That is getting up to the level that we need to, but we've got further to go, which is why, in very difficult circumstances, money is not awash, as has been clear from our discussion. The fact that extra money, that £15 billion has been found to invest in housing is very important. But let me pick up Diane's point on the borrowing. Yes, absolutely.
This is the problem. Yes. Tories talk about building houses, but they are not houses that people on average salaries can afford.
All right. Hold on. No, we can't. All right. We have to avoid this becoming the House of Commons. We've got 3 other guests here. But I'll go to you there.
Yeah, so the removal of stamp duty on house purchases for first-time buyers on £300,000 or less valued houses is a step in the right direction. But I believe that the Green Belt should be built on, and it should be built on soon, because we have I think it's about 92% of our land mass is just not built on at all. Instead of talking about council houses all the time, we need to build on what land we already have that's not utilised. Make like new garden cities like Milton Keynes did in the 70s. We should have more projects like that.
It's slowed down because we won't build in places you think we should.
Yeah, we should definitely Milton Keynes in, I think, was it the 60s or 70s?
Stuart Rose, what do you think?
Well, I think there is plenty of brown space available to build on as well. I think you know that. There is plenty of green. But the real issue is nobody's arguing. We need to build more houses. And what I say is, frankly, as somebody from business, is I've heard politicians, and we heard from Greg from both parties for 50 years telling us they're going to build 200, 300, 200, 300. They never meet the targets. They never put enough money. And the real reason is there's not enough joined-up infrastructure, incentives in place for councils to build social housing or for builders to build affordable housing or for that to be done in a way which is seamless. And I'm afraid also, which goes back to the skills conversation we had, we actually don't have enough trained people at the moment. One of the reasons you can't build houses is we don't have enough builders.
That's exactly my point.
And we need to train builders.
What about the freedom of councils to build houses in their own areas? What
and
are the
also
hiccups
for them
about?
to borrow enough money to be able to do so.
You think they should be allowed
yes.
to? Well, he says they can't be allowed to.
Well, anything can be done, David, if we want to. We can change the rules.
Greg, why don't you change the rules? I'll come to you. Just briefly. Try and explain what the constraint is that stops you doing what Stuart Rose is suggesting.
The constraint is this, that we have one of the highest levels of debt still in the Western world. It is well over 85% of our national income. And the trouble is that you can't just borrow more and more and more and add to that debt without interest rates rising and without lenders not being willing to support you. And if you do that, you pay more interest on that debt.
So you think the Labour policy...
Yes.
Hang on, you think Labour is always saying, as Diane just said, interest rates are very low at the moment. You're saying if they do borrow more, interest rates will rise. Diane equally says, but you make money on what you invest.
So interest rates are at a near historic low, as we know. But already today, the annual interest on our national debt last year was £48 billion. Now, if I tell you that the police budget is £12 billion, I don't think that adding more to our interest payments that would have to be at the expense of public services is the responsible way to go. Right. Of course, we'd like to have more housing, but we have to be responsible.
Bernard.
For me, I just think that at the moment, clearly we've got a massive problem. We need 200,000 houses a year for a while. And the response at the moment, I think, is quite incremental. You know, 20,000 is nowhere near, and there are two effects, obviously. One is that the price of the houses that are there are getting more and more expensive, and some people haven't got houses. And there was a report by Mark Easton on BBC News about 4 weeks ago now. And some people who didn't... This happened to be London, and they were people who were families who were living in a pub, who were, you know, in single rooms, sharing one room, and it just looked... Well, it didn't look awful, it was awful. And that in this country, in this day and age, that was happening. Now, I'm sure nobody wants that, but that's a pretty awful state to get to. So of all the things that we might need a czar for, you might just need somebody to grab this and then do lots of things, not one thing. And I think, I agree with this gentleman over here that, you know, all right, it's good for the 300,000, but alone that won't do it. I don't think $1 billion's going to do it. And, you know, things like infrastructure, it's the job of government to put in roads and rails so that builders can build around it. Then you will get things to happen. You can tax incentivise it. You can innovate. You don't have to carry on building buildings in the same way. We've had prefab buildings. I mean, you can get top-end range houses now, prefabs. Why can't we get mid-range houses? You can speed up planning. I agree, actually, with rent controls, provided it was an interim measure. Yeah. I think if you disturb the market too long, I don't think that's wise for anybody. You could do it for 3 to 5 years while some of these things took effect. But I do think it needs a comprehensive plan, and it doesn't feel at the minute comprehensive. And you've got a lot of people who are losing, well, their life chance as kids as they're growing through pretty awful circumstances. I think we need to do something quickly.
OK, let's go to our audience. Go, you, sir. Yes, you.
I think it's an absolute disgrace for the Minister to rely on this argument about lack of money. He ought to live in Colchester. There is no infrastructure here to support the housing. The hospital can't cope.
John, just explain what you mean.
Well, Colchester is probably one of the largest areas of house building in the southeast of England. That's the first point. It has had record number of houses. It outperforms all the Essex towns by a country mile. And yet, the council here is determined to build 920 homes a year. The hospital can't cope, the roads can't cope, the schools can't cope. Right?
So you think that the government's ambitions are over-ambitious in terms of Colchester? There are too many houses being built?
Yes, they're trying to lump more houses on Colchester. This is what their latest white paper is saying. The Colchester Borough Council have rejected that approach, but they want, because Colchester has delivered so many houses in the past, they want to lump more houses on Colchester. And the people of Colchester are completely fed up with it.
OK. Dreda.
That's a very interesting... I mean, I completely agree. There has to be infrastructure. You can't just build. You have to service your actual community. But I keep going back to the question about stamp duty. And before I came today, I went back to where I grew up, which is a very poor part of East London. And I went online to look at some houses on one of those online websites that collates all the information about all the property being sold. 42 pages, 25 properties a page. I got to page 20 before I found anything that was under £1 million. Yeah. And when I got to page 42, there were no properties that were 500,000 or less. This is the reality for lots of people who live in some of our cities, particularly places like London. So for me, and I'm completely in agreement with Bernard, Greg, the government have got to have an overall strategy. And I feel it should be a strategy that stops talking about housing. It has to include rent. We need to start talking about homes. Let's have a home strategy. If we start talking about people need homes where they live, where they can have roots, where their children can grow up, it just changes the narrative completely. Because very often we think about housing, we think of bricks and mortar, and very often we're actually thinking about investment. Let's start thinking about making homes for people in Britain.
Thank you. Right. We're more than halfway through, well over halfway through. I want to go on to some other subjects, but let me just take a couple more points from our audience. The woman there in... Yes, you.
I feel like I'm part of the generation that's never going to be able to afford my own home. I have a fairly good salary. I pay a very expensive rent, which means I cannot save. These 920 houses that Colchester are committed to building, I'd love to be able to afford one. I can't save for a deposit. I could easily pay for a mortgage. It'd be a lot cheaper than my rent.
OK.
What do I do?
The man at the very back there, behind you. You at the very back, yes.
Of course, a lack of house building is one of the main contributors to the housing crisis, but what's the government going to do about land banking, which is often overlooked, where effectively landlords profit from people being homeless?
OK, and can
I just come in on...
You could just briefly answer John, because then we've got to move on.
I will answer John. So John is absolutely right in saying that infrastructure has to accompany house building, and it goes to Bernard's point that the package that Sajid Javid announced included infrastructure to support house building, and to the gentleman's point there, he's absolutely right. We've had 322,000 planning permissions, but only about half have been built out. So again, what my colleague has proposed is that there are powers to allow councils to get those homes built rather than just sitting with planning permissions. That's why you do need to bring it together into a strategy. There's not one single panacea. You need to work across all fronts.
I'm afraid at this point we had to curtail this edition of Question Time. A member of the audience was taken ill and couldn't safely be moved. So we had to bring the programme to a close. Let me just tell you about next Thursday. Question Time is coming from Scarborough. We've got, among others, the Labour MP Chuka Umunna, the former Greek Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis, and the new leader of UKIP, Henry Bolton, on the panel there. And the week after that, we're going to be in Swansea. So call 0330 123 99 88 if you'd like to be in either audience, or go to the Question Time website on the screen there and follow the instructions. Question Time Extra Time follows us on 5 Live. And once again, my apologies for this curtailed edition of Question Time. Until next Thursday, from Colchester,